Tonight, we travel back in time to uncover the story of one of Japan's most misunderstood and fascinating traditions. We step into the hidden world of the geisha, where art and discipline intertwine, where beauty is cultivated through years of sacrifice, and where women became living embodiments of cultural preservation. Before we begin, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the narrow, lantern-lit streets of old Kyoto. The sound of wooden Gita sandals clicking against stone pathways echoes through the evening air. A figure emerges from the shadows, moving with a grace that seems almost otherworldly. Her face is painted white as fresh snow, her lips a perfect crimson bloom. The silk of her kimono rustles softly, adorned with patterns that tell stories of seasons and centuries. She is a geisha, and her life is nothing like what the world has been led to believe. The very word geisha carries weight and mystery. In Japanese, it is written with two characters that mean something quite simple yet profound. The first character means art or skill. The second means person. A geisha, then, is literally an art person, someone who has dedicated their entire being to mastering the traditional arts of Japan. Yet somehow, across oceans and through decades of misunderstanding, this elegant truth became twisted into something entirely different in the Western imagination. To understand what life was really like as a geisha, we must first travel back through the mists of history to a time when Japan was transforming, when ancient traditions were being codified, and when entertainment itself was becoming an art form worthy of a lifetime's devotion. The story of the geisha does not begin where you might expect. It does not start with women at all. In the early decades of the 18th century, sometime around 1730, the first geisha appeared in the pleasure quarters of Edo, the city that would one day become Tokyo. These early geisha were men, known as taikomochi or hokan. They were jesters and entertainers who worked in the licensed quarters where courtesans held court, providing comic relief and conversation for wealthy patrons who came seeking refinement and escape from the rigid structures of everyday life in feudal Japan. These male entertainers told jokes, performed music, and served as a kind of master of ceremonies at gatherings. They were skilled in the art of keeping conversation flowing, of easing social tensions, and of creating an atmosphere where powerful men could relax and enjoy themselves. They played drums, hence the name taikomochi, which refers to someone who carries a drum. They were valued for their wit and their ability to read a room, to know when to be loud and when to fade into the background. But even before these male geisha emerged, the seeds of what would become the geisha tradition were being planted in the soil of Japanese culture. As far back as the 7th century, there existed women called saburuko, which meant serving girls. These women were often from families displaced by war, wandering from place to place seeking survival. Some offered their bodies for money, while others found their value in entertainment at high-class social gatherings. They danced, they sang, they poured sake, and they provided companionship that was valued for its artistry as much as for its sensuality. When the imperial court moved to Heian-kyo, which we now know as Kyoto, in the year 794, something profound began to develop in Japanese culture. This was the beginning of the Heian period, an era that would last until 1185 and would establish many of the aesthetic ideals that still define Japanese art today. During this time, skilled female performers called shirabyoshi dancers thrived. They performed at the imperial court, creating traditions of female dance and performance that would echo through the centuries and eventually contribute to the emergence of the geisha profession. The Heian period was a time when beauty was understood differently than it is today. It was not found in bold statements or dramatic gestures, but in subtlety and suggestion. The glimpse of a wrist emerging from a layered kimono sleeve, the way light filtered through translucent paper screens, the careful arrangement of autumn leaves in a simple vase. This aesthetic philosophy, this understanding that profound beauty lives in the spaces between things, in what is implied rather than stated, would become central to everything the geisha represented. As centuries passed, Japan entered what historians call the Edo period, beginning in 1603 and lasting until 1868. This was a time of relative peace after generations of civil war. The Tokugawa shogunate had unified the country and established a rigid social hierarchy. Samurai warriors, no longer constantly at war, found themselves with time and inclination for cultural pursuits. Wealthy merchants, though technically lower in social status than samurai, accumulated fortunes as they were eager to spend on entertainment and luxury. It was during this era that the government established licensed pleasure quarters in major cities. These were walled districts where courtesans could legally operate under strict regulation. In Edo, this district was called Yoshiwara. In Kyoto, it was Shimabara. These quarters were designed to be spaces separate from everyday life, places where the normal rules could be bent if not broken entirely, where fantasy and reality blurred together in the soft glow of lantern light. Within these pleasure quarters, a hierarchy of courtesans developed. At the very top were the oiran, women of extraordinary beauty and accomplishment who commanded astronomical fees and whose favour was sought by the wealthiest and most powerful men in Japan. The oiran were more than prostitutes, though sexual services were part of what they offered. They were cultural icons, fashion trendsetters, accomplished performers who had been trained since childhood in music, dance, poetry, and the subtle arts of conversation and seduction. The oiran moved through the pleasure quarters in elaborate processions, wearing kimonos so heavy and ornate that they needed assistance to walk. Their hair was styled in gravity-defying arrangements, held in place with dozens of ornamental pins. They wore platform shoes called kobo that elevated them nearly a foot off the ground, forcing them to walk with a distinctive swaying gait that became a mark of their status. Everything about the oiran was designed to project an image of otherworldly beauty and refinement, but the oiran had a problem. They were so expensive, so exclusive, that ordinary wealthy men could rarely afford their company. Even those who could afford the astronomical fees found the courtesans often distant and difficult. The oiran held enormous power in their world. They could refuse clients they found distasteful. They set the terms of engagement. This was their realm, and men entered it on their terms or not at all. This is where the early geisha, both male and female, found their opportunity. Sometime around the mid-18th century, women began working as geisha in the pleasure quarters. Initially, their role was clearly defined and strictly limited. They were assistants to the oiran, there to provide entertainment while guests waited for the courtesans, or to enliven parties with music and conversation. Regulations were put in place to ensure that geisha did not compete with the courtesans for customers. Geisha were forbidden from forming personal relationships with clients. They were not even allowed to sit close to guests. The first woman widely recognized as calling herself a geisha was a Fukagawa prostitute and shamisen player named Kikuya, who began using the title around 1750. But it was another woman, a highly skilled shamisen player who became extraordinarily popular around this same time, who really opened the door for women to establish themselves as geisha in their own right. Valued not for sexual services, but for their artistic abilities and social skills. The shamisen is crucial to understanding the emergence of the female geisha. This three-stringed instrument had only recently arrived in Japan from the Ryukyu Islands, entering the country sometime in the 1560s. It was a revelation, a sound unlike anything in the traditional Japanese musical vocabulary. The shamisen produced a melancholic, almost harsh tone that could carry over the noise of crowded rooms. It could convey both delicacy and power, and it became the signature instrument of the geisha world. Women who could play the shamisen skillfully were in high demand. They could provide musical accompaniment for dances and songs. They could create atmosphere at gatherings, and importantly, they could do all this without threatening the monopoly that courtesans held on sexual services. The early female geisha carved out a niche for themselves as artists and entertainers, rather than as providers of physical intimacy. What the courtesans had not anticipated was just how appealing this would be to many customers. The geisha were more accessible, both financially and socially. They were less intimidating than the haughty oiran. They were skilled conversationalists who could make any guest feel welcome and entertained. They were cheaper to hire, and perhaps most importantly, they were genuinely interested in creating an enjoyable atmosphere rather than merely tolerating the presence of men who could afford their fees. By the early 1800s, female geisha had become so popular that they were eclipsing the courtesans entirely. The transition was gradual but inexorable. The number of female geisha grew rapidly while the status and relevance of the oiran declined. Eventually, the courtesans would disappear from Japanese culture almost entirely, while the geisha would endure and flourish, becoming the iconic symbol of traditional Japanese entertainment that they remain today. This shift was formalized through the establishment of the kenban system, a registry office that handled geisha assignments and payments for their services. This system ensured that geisha would be officially recognized as entertainers rather than prostitutes, a distinction that was crucial then and remains important now. The kenban kept records of all registered geisha, assigned them to engagements at teahouses and restaurants, and handled the complex financial arrangements that made the geisha world function. But who were these women who chose to become geisha? Where did they come from, and what led them to dedicate their lives to this demanding profession? The answers varied across time and place, but certain patterns emerged that defined the geisha world for generations. In the early days, and continuing well into the 20th century, many geisha came from desperately poor families. Japan's economy, despite the peace of the Edo period and the modernization of the Meiji era that followed, was deeply unequal. Rural families often struggled to survive, especially in years of poor harvests or natural disasters. For such families, having more children than they could feed was a common crisis. In this context, selling a daughter to a geisha house could be seen as a form of salvation for everyone involved. The family would receive a sum of money that might help them survive another season. The daughter would be given food, shelter, education, and training in valuable skills. The geisha house would gain an apprentice who, if successful, would eventually repay her purchase price many times over through her earnings. It was a transaction born of necessity, and while it may seem harsh by modern standards, it offered opportunities that would not have existed otherwise. This is important to understand because the geisha world, despite its associations with beauty and elegance, was built on a foundation of economic reality. Girls did not typically choose to become geisha out of a love for traditional arts, at least not initially. They became geisha because their families needed money, or because they had no other options, or because they saw in the geisha profession a path to a life that would be more comfortable and more respectable than the alternatives available to poor women in traditional Japan. Young girls who entered the geisha world, sometimes as young as 6 or 7 years old in the historical period, would be purchased from their families and brought to live in a nokiya, a geisha house. This would become their home, and the women who ran it would become their family for the foreseeable future. The proprietress of a nokiya was called the okasan, which literally means mother, and she would manage every aspect of the young girl's life from that point forward. The okiya was not just a residence, but a complex institution that functioned as a school, a business, and a family unit all at once. These houses were located in designated districts known as hanamachi, which translates as flower towns. These districts were the geisha quarters, recognized neighborhoods where the business of traditional entertainment took place within a framework of customs and regulations that had developed over generations. The most famous hanamachi was and remains Gion in Kyoto. Even today, to walk through Gion at dusk is to step into another time. The streets are narrow and lined with traditional wooden buildings that have stood for centuries. Paper lanterns hang at the entrances to tea houses, glowing softly as evening descends. The air carries the faint scent of incense and the distant sound of shamisen music drifting from upper floor rooms where private entertainments are taking place. In its heyday, Gion was home to hundreds of geisha and their apprentices. Every okiya housed multiple women at various stages of training and career. The tea houses where they worked lined every street. Wealthy men from across Japan and even from abroad came to Gion seeking the refined entertainment that only geisha could provide. The district thrived on the interlocking relationships between okiya houses, tea houses, patrons, and the geisha themselves, all operating within an elaborate system of obligations and customs that outsiders could barely comprehend. But Gion was not the only hanamachi in Kyoto. The city also had Pontocho, a narrow alley running parallel to the Kamo River, where geisha houses and tea houses were packed tightly together. There was Miyagawa-cho and Kamishichi-ken, each district with its own character and traditions. Tokyo, too, had its hanamachi, with Shinbashi being perhaps the most prestigious, along with areas like Akasaka and Asakusa. Kanazawa, Osaka, Nagoya, and other major cities developed their own geisha districts, each contributing to the rich variety of regional styles and traditions within the broader geisha culture. Within these hanamachi, the okiya served as the foundation of geisha life. These houses were owned and operated by women, creating a rare matriarchal space in a society that was overwhelmingly dominated by men. The okasan who ran an okiya was typically a former geisha herself, a woman who had achieved enough success and saved enough money to establish her own house. This position gave her enormous power and responsibility. She would be the one to decide which young girls to accept into her house. She would oversee their training, she would manage their careers once they began working, and she would handle all the complex financial and social arrangements that kept the business running. Living in an okiya meant entering into a world governed by strict hierarchy and ritual. Every aspect of daily life was structured according to principles of respect and seniority. The youngest and newest members of the household would be given the most menial tasks. They would wake earliest, go to bed latest, and spend their days in ceaseless service to their elders. This was not cruelty but tradition, a system designed to instill discipline and respect, while also teaching the countless small skills that would be necessary for success as a geisha. For a young girl arriving at an okiya for the first time, probably scared and homesick, the initial period must have been overwhelming. Everything was strange and new. The rules were complex and had to be learned quickly. The older girls and women in the house would be simultaneously her teachers and her taskmasters, quick to correct any mistake and slow to offer praise. The work was endless, from cleaning and cooking to running errands and assisting the senior geisha with their preparations for evening engagements. This initial stage of training was called shikomi, which means in training or preparation. A girl at this stage was a shikomi-san, the lowest rank in the geisha hierarchy. She would typically remain at this level for about a year, though the exact duration depended on her progress and the judgment of her teachers. During this time, she was not yet learning the performance arts that would define her future career. Instead, she was learning the basics, the foundation upon which everything else would eventually be built. The day began early for a shikomi-san, often before dawn. She would rise and immediately begin her household duties. The okiya had to be kept immaculate. Every surface had to be cleaned, every floor swept and polished. In traditional Japanese homes, this was no small task. The tatami mats that covered the floors were delicate and required special care. The sliding shoji screens had to be opened and closed carefully to avoid damaging the rice paper. The entranceway had to be prepared perfectly for the coming and going of the senior geisha and any visitors who might call. Breakfast had to be prepared, not just for the shikomi-san herself, but for everyone in the household. Rice had to be washed and cooked. Soup had to be made from scratch. Fish had to be grilled. Vegetables had to be prepared and pickled according to recipes that had been passed down through generations. The shikomi-san would watch and assist as more senior members of the household demonstrated these tasks, gradually learning the skills that would allow her to take on more responsibility. After breakfast, there would be more cleaning, more organizing, more of the endless small tasks that kept a traditional household functioning. Laundry had to be done by hand, which for kimono was an intricate process requiring great care to avoid damage. The elaborate garments had to be carefully disassembled before washing, as many kimono were not sewn with permanent stitches, but held together with temporary basting that would be removed for cleaning. Each piece had to be washed separately, dried flat to prevent stretching, and then reassembled. The kimono themselves were works of art, and learning to care for them properly was crucial training. A shikomi-san would spend hours watching and assisting as more experienced women worked with these precious garments. She would learn which fabrics could tolerate what treatments, how to remove stains without damaging delicate silk, how to store kimono properly to prevent fading or damage from insects. She would also begin to learn the complex process of putting on a kimono, a skill that would take years to master, and that would eventually need to be performed daily in less than an hour. Beyond household tasks, a shikomi-san also began basic lessons in the arts that would define her future career. She would start attending classes at the kaburenjo, the training school associated with her hanamachi. Here, she would begin learning traditional Japanese dance, starting with the most basic movements and positions. She would be introduced to the shamisen and other traditional instruments, though at this stage she would mostly just hold them and learn their names rather than actually playing them. These early lessons were often frustrating. Traditional Japanese arts emphasize precision and perfection, with teachers who were demanding and quick to criticize any error. A dance movement that seemed simple would be repeated hundreds of times until it could be performed exactly right. Sitting in Caesar position, the formal kneeling posture used in traditional settings, had to be mastered even though it was painful and uncomfortable at first. Everything about the training was designed to instill discipline and attention to detail. The shikomi-san also began learning the complex language and etiquette of the geisha world. the way one spoke to elders versus equals versus outsiders, the precise depth of bow appropriate for different situations, the proper way to serve tea, to pour sake, to open and close doors, how to walk gracefully in kimono, taking small steps and keeping the body upright, how to manage the long sleeves of traditional garments without letting them drag or get in the way, how to sit, stand, kneel and move through a room with the kind of fluid grace that would eventually define her as a geisha. Perhaps most challenging, especially for girls who came from rural areas or from non-elite backgrounds, was learning to speak properly. Each hanamachi had its own distinctive dialect, often archaic forms of Japanese that were maintained as markers of tradition and exclusivity. In Kyoto, the Maiko and geisha spoke in Kyoto Ben, the local dialect with its characteristic soft vowels and distinctive vocabulary. But beyond regional dialect, there was also the formal, elaborate speech patterns expected in professional settings, filled with honorific forms and indirect expressions that could take years to master. After about a year of this intensive foundational training, if a shikomi-san had proven herself capable and dedicated, she would be allowed to take an examination. This test would assess her knowledge of basic etiquette, her progress in dance and music, and her overall readiness to advance to the next stage. If she passed, she would move on to become a minarai, which means learning by watching. The minarai stage was short, typically lasting only about a month, but it was crucial. This was the first time the young trainee would actually attend ozashiki, the exclusive banquets where geisha entertained their clients. However, as a minarai she would not yet perform or actively participate. Instead, she would sit quietly, observe, and learn by watching how more experienced geisha conducted themselves. During this month, the minarai would be assigned an one-san, an older sister. This would be a fully qualified geisha who would serve as her mentor, teacher, and protector throughout her apprenticeship and beyond. The relationship between one-san and Imuto, younger sister, was formalized through a ceremony called Sansan Kudo, the 3x3 exchange of sake cups. This ritual, also used in Japanese wedding ceremonies, created a bond that was considered as significant as family ties. The one-san would take her young charge everywhere. The minarai would accompany her to engagements, watching and learning. She would help her one-san prepare for these outings, learning the intricate process of applying makeup and arranging hair. She would observe conversations and note which topics were discussed and which were avoided. She would see how experienced geisha navigated the complex social dynamics of a banquet, balancing the needs of different guests, keeping conversations flowing, knowing when to be forward and when to fade into the background. This observational learning was considered essential because much of what made a successful geisha could not be taught through formal instruction. It had to be absorbed through experience, through watching and imitating, through developing an intuitive sense for social situations that could only come from exposure. The minarai learned not just what to do, but how to read a room, how to sense what guests needed even before they expressed it, how to be simultaneously present and unobtrusive. After this month of observation, the young woman would undergo her official debut ceremony called Misedashi. This was a significant occasion that marked her entry into professional life as a maiko, an apprentice geisha. The ceremony involved visiting various important people and places throughout the hanamachi. Dressed in formal attire and accompanied by her one-san and the oka-san of her okiya, the new maiko would pay respects at tea houses where she would be working, at the houses of important teachers, and at the Kenban registry office where she would be officially recorded. For the Misedashi ceremony, The Maiko would wear a special black kimono decorated with 5 family crests, called a kuramotsuki. This formal garment marked the significance of the occasion. Her makeup would be applied with particular care, with 3 distinctive lines of bare skin left showing on the back of her neck, in a pattern that symbolized her status as a new Maiko. Her hair would be arranged in a special style, adorned with elaborate ornaments including 2 silver fan-shaped hairpins and gold and silver decorations under her top knot. The walls of her okiya would be decorated with red and white paper and auspicious images to mark this joyful occasion. It was a celebration of all the hard work that had brought her to this point, and a recognition of the challenging journey that still lay ahead. From this day forward, she would be known by her geisha name, typically derived from her Wanasan's name as a mark of their connection. She would no longer be a child in training, but a professional performer, albeit one who still had years of learning ahead of her. Life as a Maiko was the most visible and in many ways the most demanding stage of the journey to becoming geisha. Maiko are what most people picture when they think of geisha. They are the young women with the elaborate hairstyles done in their own hair, the brilliant multicolored kimono with sleeves that hang nearly to the ground, the red and white makeup, the distinctive okobo platform shoes that make their distinctive clicking sound as they walk. They are beautiful and exotic, living embodiments of an aesthetic tradition that stretches back centuries. But behind this beauty lay a life of extraordinary discipline and sacrifice. The daily schedule of a Maiko was exhausting, designed to squeeze every possible hour into training and work. A typical day might begin around 9 or 10 in the morning, later than the early rising required of shikomi, but still with much to accomplish before evening. Upon waking, the Maiko would first check her hair. This was always a concern because Maiko wore their hair in elaborate traditional styles that had to last for about a week between visits to the hairdresser. These styles, with names like warashinobu and fuku, required the hair to be pulled, teased, and shaped into complex arrangements that were then held in place with pomade and wax. Once set, the hair had to be protected at all costs because having it restyled was both expensive and time-consuming. To preserve their hairstyles, Maiko slept on special pillows called takamakura. These were not soft pillows like we might use today, but rather hard platforms that elevated and supported the neck while keeping the head suspended above the sleeping surface. Imagine trying to sleep with your neck resting on a small wooden bench while your elaborately styled hair hovers unsupported above you. Any movement in the night, any rolling to the side could ruin hours of a hairstylist's work. Maiko learned to sleep very still, often remaining in the same position all night despite the discomfort. In the morning, if her hair had survived the night intact, she would carefully adjust any ornaments that might have shifted, add or change the flowers or other decorations according to the season and any special engagements scheduled for that day, and ensure that everything was perfect before leaving her room. This attention to detail in appearance was not vanity, but professional necessity. A Maiko's appearance was her calling card, the visual representation of her dedication to her art. After checking her appearance, the Maiko would join the other residents of the okiya for a communal breakfast. This meal would typically be simple but nourishing. Traditional Japanese breakfast foods like rice, miso soup, grilled fish, pickled vegetables, and green tea. It was one of the few times during the day when all the women of the house would gather together, and it served as an opportunity for the okasan to discuss the day's schedule, assign any special tasks, and ensure that everyone knew what was expected of them. Following breakfast, the Maiko would prepare to leave for her morning lessons. These classes took place at the Kaburenjo, the training center associated with her Hanamachi. Each district had its own kaburenjo, functioning as both a school and a theatre where geisha could practice and occasionally give public performances. The building would be traditional in style, with tatami-floored rooms where lessons took place under the watchful eyes of teachers who were often legendary figures in their respective arts. The morning lessons typically ran from around 11 in the morning until early afternoon, usually structured in 50-minute sessions with short breaks in between to allow students to move from one class to another. A maiko might have dance class with one of the great masters of traditional Nihon Buyo dance. These lessons were rigorous, focusing on precise movements of hands, feet, and body. The subtle shifts in expression and posture that could convey complex emotions without words. Dance in the geisha tradition was not like Western ballet or modern dance. It did not emphasize high leaps or rapid spins. Instead, it was a dance of controlled restraint, where a slight turn of the head or the angle at which a fan was held could speak volumes. The maiko would practice the same sequence of movements again and again, with the teacher offering corrections on the placement of a finger, the angle of the torso, the timing of a step. Perfection was the goal, and it required endless repetition. After dance might come shamisen lessons. The shamisen was the core instrument of the geisha world, and every maiko had to achieve at least basic competency in playing it. The instrument looks somewhat like a banjo, with a long neck and a body covered in cat or dog skin that creates its characteristic sharp, resonant sound. It is played with a large plectrum called a bachi, and the techniques for playing it are complex and demanding. The shamisen accompanied most geisha dances and songs, providing not just melody but also rhythmic punctuation and emotional coloring. A skilled shamisen player could make the instrument speak, cry, laugh. The maiko would learn traditional pieces that had been passed down for generations, memorizing not just the notes, but the subtle variations in timing and emphasis that distinguished a merely competent performance from a truly moving one. Other lessons might include instruction in traditional singing, learning the long narrative songs called nagauta, or the shorter, more intimate kuta. The tea ceremony, that quintessential Japanese ritual of preparing and serving matcha green tea with precise choreographed movements, had to be learned and practiced until every gesture became second nature. Flower arrangement, ikebana, taught principles of balance and space and natural beauty. Calligraphy trained the hand to move with controlled grace, while also imparting knowledge of classical poetry and literature. All of these arts were interconnected, sharing common aesthetic principles. The concept of ma, the meaningful space between things, the idea that beauty emerges from simplicity and restraint rather than from elaboration and excess. The understanding that mastery comes not from adding more, but from refining and paring away until only the essential remains. These were lessons that went beyond technical skill, shaping not just what the maiko could do, but how she understood the world. Around 1 in the afternoon there would be a break for lunch. The maiko might return to her okiya to eat, or she might grab something quick at a nearby shop. This brief respite was cherished because the rest of the day would be intensely demanding. After lunch, more lessons would continue until around 4 in the afternoon. Senior geisha, who had already completed years of training, might finish their obligations earlier, but maiko were expected to maximize every available hour of instruction. At 4 o'clock it was time to return to the okiya and begin preparing for the evening's work. This preparation was elaborate and time-consuming, a ritual that transformed the young woman from a student into a maiko. First, there would be a light early dinner, eaten quickly because maiko were not permitted to eat during ozashiki. even though their clients would be feasting on elaborate multi-course meals. This restriction was both practical, to avoid smearing makeup or staining the kimono, and symbolic, reinforcing that the maiko was there to serve and entertain rather than to indulge. After eating, the real work of transformation began. The makeup application process took approximately 40 minutes and required intense concentration and a steady hand. First, the maiko would apply bintsuke abura, a waxy oil substance that created a base for the makeup and helped it adhere to the skin. This oil had a distinctive smell and a slightly greasy texture that would feel strange at first, but that maiko grew accustomed to over time. Next came the oshiroi, the white powder that is perhaps the most recognizable element of geisha makeup. This powder was traditionally made from rice flour, though in earlier eras it had been made from lead, which poisoned generations of geisha before its dangers were understood. The powder would be mixed with water to create a paste, then applied to the face, neck and chest using a special brush made from bamboo. The application had to be even and smooth, creating a perfect white surface. But importantly, not every part of the skin was painted. A thin line of bare skin would be left around the hairline, creating the illusion that the white face was a mask, and on the back of the neck, arguably the most important detail of all, 2 or 3 lines of bare skin would be left unpainted, forming either a W or V shape. This deliberate exposure of the nape was deeply significant in Japanese aesthetic tradition. The neck, particularly the nape, was considered one of the most erotic parts of the female body. By painting the face and neck white, but leaving these strategic areas exposed, the makeup actually drew attention to the natural skin in a way that made it seem more alluring than if it had been left unpainted. It was a perfect example of the principle that suggestion is more powerful than revelation, that what is partially concealed becomes more desirable than what is fully displayed. Once the white base was complete, the maiko would add color. The eyes would be outlined in red and black, creating a dramatic effect that made them seem larger and more expressive. Eyebrows would be drawn in with black, and the shape and thickness would change slightly as the maiko progressed through her training, with younger maiko wearing shorter, more girlish brows and senior maiko wearing longer, more mature ones. The lips were perhaps the most distinctive part of maiko makeup. Unlike geisha, who would paint their entire lips red, junior maiko would paint only the lower lip, leaving the upper lip in its natural color. This was meant to evoke youth and innocence. As the maiko matured and gained experience, she would gradually begin painting her upper lip as well, though often still not the entire lip, leaving the edges unpainted to create a smaller, more delicate appearance than the lip's actual size. Around the time that makeup was being applied, a special person would arrive at the okiya, whose job it was to dress the maiko in her kimono. This job, called either otokoshi or kitsuke depending on the region and specific role, was crucial because putting on a formal maiko kimono was not something that could be done alone. The garments were heavy and complex, with multiple layers that had to be arranged precisely. The kimono itself was a work of art, often costing more than a luxury car in today's money. A single formal kimono could take years to create, with fabric that was dyed using traditional methods, then embroidered by hand with silk threads, sometimes incorporating real gold or silver thread. The patterns were carefully chosen to reflect the season, with cherry blossoms for spring, maple leaves for autumn, snowflakes and pine for winter. They told stories or referenced classical poetry. They represented not just clothing but wearable culture. For a maiko, the kimono had distinctively long sleeves called furizode, which could extend nearly to the ground. These long sleeves served multiple purposes. They were beautiful, creating a flowing, elegant line as the maiko moved. They marked her status as an apprentice, since geisha wore shorter sleeves, and they were practical during dance performances, when the maiko would manipulate the sleeves as part of the choreography, wrapping them around her arms or letting them trail dramatically. The obi, the wide belt that bound the kimono at the waist, was equally elaborate. For a maiko, the obi could be over 20 feet long and required special techniques to tie. In Kyoto, maiko wore their obi in a style called darari, which created a long hanging tail that reached almost to the ground at the back. This distinctive obi style was unique to Kyoto maiko and served as an instant identifier of their status. Getting dressed took time and required the dresser to pull the various layers tight, ensuring that the kimono would hang correctly and stay in place throughout an evening of movement. The process could be uncomfortable, with layers binding the torso and restricting breathing somewhat. But this restriction was part of the training. It forced the maiko to move carefully and deliberately, to maintain perfect posture, to develop the kind of controlled grace that would define her throughout her career. Once dressed and with makeup complete, the maiko would make her final preparations. She would add her kanzashi, the elaborate hair ornaments that changed monthly to reflect seasonal themes. In January, she might wear plum blossom ornaments to welcome the new year. In June, willow leaves and hydrangea. In November, maple leaves and chrysanthemums. These ornaments were works of art in themselves, often created by specialized craftsmen using traditional techniques passed down through generations. The finishing touches would include a fan, essential for dance performances and as a prop for various ritual gestures, perhaps a small coin purse or ornamental accessory hanging from her obi, and finally, the footwear. Maiko wore distinctive platform shoes called a kobo, which elevated them about 8 inches off the ground. These shoes forced a particular way of walking, taking small, careful steps and keeping the body upright to maintain balance. By around 6 in the evening, the transformation would be complete. The young woman who had sat down to begin her preparations was gone, replaced by a maiko in full regalia, a living artwork ready to step out into the evening. She would leave the okiya with her one-san, walking through the streets of the hanamachi toward whatever engagements had been arranged for that evening. This walk through the district was itself a performance. Locals and tourists alike would stop to watch and take photographs, though well-mannered observers would ask permission rather than simply pointing cameras at the maiko. The sound of her akobo on the stone pavement would announce her coming, that distinctive clacking rhythm that has echoed through these streets for centuries. She would move with studied grace, every gesture the result of years of training, aware that she represented not just herself but her okiya, her one-san, her entire hanamachi. The ozashiki, the banquet room where she would spend her evening, would typically be in a traditional teahouse called an ochaya. These establishments were the venues where the work of entertaining actually took place. They were not open to the public, but operated on a system of introduction and trust. Only established clients who had been vouched for by other regulars could make reservations. This exclusivity was part of what made the geisha world special, creating an atmosphere of intimacy and privilege. The ozashiki itself would be a room with tatami flooring, sliding paper screens, and minimal but exquisite decoration. Perhaps a hanging scroll with calligraphy or a simple ink painting, a vase with a seasonal flower arrangement, indirect lighting that created a soft, flattering ambiance. The setting was designed to showcase traditional Japanese aesthetic principles while providing a comfortable space for the evening's activities. The evening would typically begin around 6 or 7 and could last until midnight or later. During this time, the Maiko and her Ansan would provide entertainment for the guests, who were usually businessmen, politicians, or other wealthy individuals. The specific form of entertainment would vary depending on the occasion and the preferences of the guests, but certain elements were almost always present. Conversation was central to the geisha's role. She was expected to be a skilled conversationalist who could engage with anyone on any topic. This required not just social grace but actual knowledge. Geisha studied current events, politics, business, sports, and popular culture so they could discuss whatever interested their guests. They learned to read people, to sense what topics would be welcome and which should be avoided, to keep discussions flowing smoothly and ensure that every guest felt included and valued. The Maiko, being younger and less experienced, would mostly observe during conversations, occasionally contributing when appropriate but generally deferring to her Wansan and the other more senior geisha present. This was part of her continuing education, learning through example how to navigate these complex social situations. Throughout the evening, the geisha would also manage practical matters. They would keep sake cups filled, though never allowing their own cups to remain empty either, as part of the social ritual involved guests and geisha drinking together. They would light cigarettes for guests who smoked. They would call for additional food or drink as needed. All of this was done with such grace and discretion that it seemed effortless, though of course it was the result of years of training in the art of hospitality. At some point during the evening there would likely be performances. A geisha might play the shamisen while another sang a traditional song. They might perform one of the classical dances that were central to the geisha's artistic repertoire. These performances were not simply entertainment but demonstrations of years of dedicated study, opportunities for the geisha to display the skills that justified their profession's existence. When a Maiko danced, it was a moment of particular beauty and significance. She would move with studied grace, every gesture meaningful, every position held for exactly the right duration. The long sleeves of her kimono would become part of the dance, flowing and swirling as she moved. Her face, beneath its white makeup, would express subtle emotions through tiny shifts in expression. The performance might last only a few minutes, but those minutes represented thousands of hours of practice. Between performances and conversation, there were often traditional games called ozashiki asobi. These were drinking games designed to be fun and slightly silly, breaking down the formal barriers between guests and geisha. One popular game involved a sake cup being passed around while someone beat a drum, with the person left holding the cup when the drumming stopped having to drink. Another involved guessing the number of items the geisha had concealed in her sleeve. These games created laughter and a sense of playfulness that was essential to the atmosphere the geisha were creating. As the evening wore on and sake flowed more freely, the atmosphere would become more relaxed and jovial. This was when the geisha's skill in managing social dynamics became most apparent. They had to keep things lively, but not allow them to become too rowdy. They had to ensure that every guest felt entertained without letting any one person dominate. They had to be simultaneously fun and professional, accessible yet slightly mysterious. For the Maiko, these evenings were exhausting but essential. Every ozashiki was an opportunity to learn and improve. She would watch how her Wansan handled difficult guests or awkward situations. She would observe what kinds of stories and jokes worked well. She would gradually develop her own style and personality within the broader framework of geisha conduct. The evening would finally end around midnight, though sometimes later. The Maiko and Geisha would bid farewell to their guests with elaborate politeness, thanking them for their patronage and hoping to see them again soon. Then they would step back out into the night, this time walking back through now quiet streets toward their okiya. The first thing they would do upon returning home was remove all the elaborate trappings of their profession. The makeup would be carefully cleaned off, a process that required oil to break down the waxy base, and then gentle cleansing to remove every trace of white paint. The hair ornaments would be removed and carefully stored. The kimono would be taken off with assistance and hung to air, inspected for any stains or damage that might need attention. Only after all this was complete could the Maiko finally relax. She might bathe, washing away the remaining traces of makeup and the build-up of the long day. She might have a light snack since she had not eaten a substantial meal since early afternoon. She might chat quietly with the other residents of the okiya, comparing notes about their respective evenings. Finally, around 2 or 3 in the morning, she would retire to her room and carefully position herself on the takamakura pillow, trying to find a comfortable position that would not disturb her hairstyle, and there she would sleep for a few brief hours before waking to do it all again. This was the life of a Maiko day after day for years. This apprenticeship period typically lasted 5 to 6 years. During this entire time, the Maiko lived according to strict rules that governed nearly every aspect of her life. She lived in the okiya, where her behavior and schedule were closely monitored. She had almost no personal freedom. She could not date or have romantic relationships. She could not own a cell phone or personal money beyond a small allowance. Her entire existence was oriented around training and work. This might seem oppressive, and in many ways it was. But it was also understood as necessary for the development of the skills and discipline required for success. The geisha world demanded total dedication. It was not something one could do casually or as a side interest. It required immersion, a complete transformation of self that could only happen when distractions and alternatives were removed. The financial arrangements during this period were complex and often controversial. All the money that a Maiko earned went directly to her okiya, not to her. This system existed because the okiya had invested enormous sums in her training and maintenance. Everything she wore, every lesson she took, every meal she ate, the room she lived in, all of this was provided by the okiya and represented a substantial financial outlay. A single kimono might cost $30,000 or more. A Maiko would need multiple kimono for different seasons and occasions. The elaborate wigs that geisha wore cost thousands of dollars each and required regular professional maintenance. Lessons with master teachers were expensive. The food and housing costs for supporting multiple residents in an expensive urban location added up quickly. By the time a Maiko had completed her training, the okiya might have invested the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars in her development. The system was designed so that the Maiko would eventually repay this debt through her earnings. But during her apprenticeship, she saw little of that money herself. This arrangement had defenders who argued it was a fair business model, necessary for sustaining the expensive infrastructure of the geisha world. It also had critics who saw it as exploitative, trapping women in a form of indentured servitude where they had to work for years just to break even. The reality probably lay somewhere between these extremes. Some Maiko found the arrangement acceptable, even beneficial, as it provided them with training and opportunities they would never have had otherwise. Others chafed against the restrictions and the feeling that they were working primarily to enrich their okiya rather than themselves. Individual experiences varied greatly depending on the character of the Oki-san running the house and the specific circumstances of each Maiko's situation. Throughout these years, the Maiko's appearance and role would gradually change in subtle ways that marked her progression. As a junior Maiko, she wore the brightest, most ornate kimono with the longest sleeves. Her makeup was most elaborate, with only the lower lip painted. Her hair ornaments were large and showy. She was the most visible, the most decorative element of any gathering she attended. As she gained experience and matured, these elements would gradually become more subdued. Her kimono, while still beautiful, would feature slightly more muted colours and simpler patterns. She would begin painting her upper lip as well as her lower, moving toward the fuller lip paint of a geisha. Her hair ornaments would become somewhat less elaborate. These changes signaled to those familiar with the geisha world that she was progressing, becoming more accomplished and less of a novelty. The most significant changes came during the final months of her apprenticeship. Around 1 to 2 months before her planned transition to geisha status, a senior Maiko would change her hairstyle to one called sako. This was a special style traditionally worn by young married women, and wearing it as a Maiko was symbolic, representing a kind of marriage to her art. During this sako period, which lasted only a few weeks, the Maiko would make special appearances at teahouses throughout her district, essentially saying goodbye to her role as an apprentice. In some regions, during this period, the Maiko would also undergo a practice called teeth blackening, or ohaguro. This was an ancient Japanese custom that had once been common among married women and members of the imperial court. The practice involved applying a mixture containing iron filings, gallnuts, and vinegar to the teeth, staining them black. This was believed to be beautiful, and also thought to protect teeth from decay. For a Maiko to blacken her teeth during her sako period was another element of the symbolic marriage to her art, taking on the appearance of a married woman as she prepared to become a fully independent geisha. However, this practice was controversial even within the geisha world and was not universally observed. By the late 20th century it had become quite rare, though some traditional districts still maintained the custom. The actual transition from Maiko to geisha was marked by a ceremony called a rike, which literally means collar turning. This referred to the change from the red collar of a Maiko's kimono to the white collar of a geisha. The ceremony would take place at the okiya and would involve the okayasan or wane-san formally cutting off the Maiko's top knot, a symbolic gesture representing the end of her apprenticeship. After the erike ceremony, the young woman was finally a geisha. She would no longer style her hair in the elaborate traditional arrangements, but would instead wear wigs, called katsura, which were much more convenient and comfortable. Her kimono would have shorter sleeves and more sophisticated, subdued designs. Most importantly, she would have much more personal freedom and control over her own life. As a geisha, she could choose to leave the okiya and live independently, though many chose to remain closely connected to their house, which had become family. She would receive a larger share of her earnings, allowing her to begin building savings and financial security. She could have relationships if she chose, though marriage remained complicated, as many traditional clients preferred geisha to remain single and fully devoted to their profession. The daily life of a geisha was in many ways similar to that of a Maiko, but with important differences. She still woke mid-morning, still attended regular lessons to maintain and refine her skills, still spent evenings entertaining at ozashiki. But she had more autonomy in choosing which engagements to accept, more say in her career direction, and the option to specialize more fully in particular arts that interested her most. Some geisha became known primarily as dancers, spending years perfecting their technique and eventually becoming teachers themselves. Others focused on musical performance, becoming virtuosos of the shamisen, or experts in traditional singing. Some were renowned for their skills as conversationalists and hostesses, women whose presence could make any gathering successful through the force of their personality and social intelligence alone. The relationship between a geisha and her clients was complex and varied greatly from case to case. At its core, it was a professional relationship. Clients paid for the geisha's time and entertainment. They came to Ozashiki to enjoy her company, her conversation, her performances. The financial transactions were handled through the Ochaya teahouse and the Kenban registry, ensuring that the relationship remained proper and professional. However, the geisha world has always existed in a space where professional and personal relationships could blur. A geisha might develop genuine friendships with regular clients, looking forward to their visits and enjoying their company beyond the purely transactional aspect. She might receive gifts from appreciative patrons, valuable kimono or jewelry, or help with expenses that her earnings alone could not cover. In some cases, a particularly close relationship might develop between a geisha and a wealthy patron, leading to what was called a dana arrangement. A dana was essentially a primary patron who provided ongoing financial support to a geisha in exchange for exclusivity and priority access to her time. This arrangement was formalized through a ceremony similar to marriage and provided significant financial security for the geisha, allowing her to focus on her art without worrying as much about the commercial aspects of her work. The dana relationship has been controversial and is often misunderstood. Some people interpret it as a form of prostitution, assuming that sexual services were the primary or sole purpose. While physical intimacy might be part of some dana relationships, it was not their defining characteristic. The arrangement was primarily about financial support and social status. A geisha with a prominent dana had prestige and security. The dana gained the cachet of being associated with a cultured, accomplished woman and had privileged access to her company and performances. It is crucial to understand that geisha were not prostitutes, even though their world existed adjacent to the pleasure quarters where prostitution was legal and regulated. The distinction was carefully maintained through licensing and regulation. Geisha were licensed as entertainers, specifically forbidden from selling sexual services. Courtesans held prostitution licenses and operated under different rules. While individual geisha might choose to have sexual relationships with clients, this was their personal decision and was not part of their professional role. This distinction was often lost on Westerners who encountered geisha culture, particularly during and after World War II. When American forces occupied Japan following the war, many Japanese women working as prostitutes began dressing in kimono and advertising themselves as geisha to attract foreign clients who were fascinated by this exotic aspect of Japanese culture. These women, often called geisha girls by the servicemen, were not real geisha and had no training in traditional arts, but their presence reinforced Western misconceptions about geisha being essentially prostitutes in elaborate costumes. This confusion persisted for decades and continues to some degree today, perpetuated by popular culture representations that fail to understand or accurately portray what geisha actually do. The publication of Arthur Golden's novel, Memoirs of a Geisha in 1997, and its subsequent film adaptation in 2005, brought worldwide attention to geisha culture but also reinforced some misunderstandings while introducing new ones. The novel, presented as if written by a real geisha, was actually entirely fictional, and included details that real geisha found inaccurate or misleading. This persistence of misconceptions about geisha has frustrated those within the profession who see themselves as artists and cultural preservationists rather than sex workers. Modern geisha often emphasize their training in traditional arts, their role in maintaining cultural traditions that might otherwise be lost, and their professional status as skilled entertainers. They want the world to understand that their profession is honorable and demanding, requiring years of dedicated study and continuing practice. The peak of the geisha profession came in the early 20th century. In the 1920s, it is estimated that there were as many as 80,000 geisha working throughout Japan. Every major city had multiple hanamechi. Even smaller towns often had at least a few geisha who provided entertainment at local establishments. The profession was thriving, and geisha were recognized as leaders in fashion and culture, their styles and sensibilities influencing broader Japanese society. But even at this peak, changes were underway that would eventually lead to a dramatic decline in the number of geisha. Japan was modernizing rapidly, adopting Western technology, ideas, and customs. Young women were gaining access to education and employment opportunities that had never existed before. The rigid social structures that had defined Japanese society for centuries were loosening, and with that loosening came challenges to traditional institutions like the geisha system. The outbreak of World War II dealt a severe blow to the geisha world. As Japan mobilized for total war, resources and attention that might have gone to supporting traditional entertainment were redirected to the military effort. Many hanamachi struggled to remain open, some closed entirely. Women who might have become geisha instead took jobs in factories producing military supplies, and the men who had been the primary patrons of geisha were either away at war or had no time or resources for such luxuries. The immediate post-war period was even more devastating. Japan was occupied by American forces, the economy was in shambles, and traditional social structures had been severely disrupted. The geisha world was trying to recover and rebuild, but it faced enormous challenges. This was when the geisha girl phenomenon did its greatest damage to the profession's reputation, as prostitutes claiming to be geisha created confusion about what geisha actually were. As Japan recovered economically in the 1950s and 1960s, the geisha profession stabilized somewhat but never returned to its pre-war prominence. The nature of entertainment was changing. New forms of leisure were emerging. Bar hostesses, working in Western-style bars and clubs, began to take over some of the social functions that geisha had traditionally fulfilled, offering conversation and companionship to businessmen, but without the elaborate training, strict traditions, or expensive formality of the geisha world. Karaoke, which emerged in the 1970s, provided a form of interactive entertainment that could be enjoyed without the need for skilled performers. Why pay expensive fees to watch geisha perform when you and your colleagues could sing yourselves? Television, and later the internet, offered countless entertainment options that competed for people's time and attention. The exclusive, tradition-bound world of the geisha began to seem outdated to many Japanese, a relic of the past rather than a living part of contemporary culture. The economic factors were significant too. Entertaining clients at an ochaya with geisha in attendance was extraordinarily expensive. A single evening might cost thousands of dollars, and that was before the food and drink. Such expenses could only be justified by the wealthiest individuals or by companies with large entertainment budgets. As the Japanese economy shifted and corporate spending on entertainment faced greater scrutiny, these traditional forms of expensive hospitality became harder to maintain. By the 1990s and early 2000s, the number of geisha had declined to just a few thousand, with the majority concentrated in Kyoto and Tokyo. Smaller cities and towns that once had thriving geisha communities saw their last geisha retire without replacement. Entire hanamachi closed, their traditional buildings being converted to other uses or torn down for modern development. The geisha who remained were increasingly seen less as fashionable entertainers and more as guardians of tradition, living embodiments of a cultural heritage that was rapidly disappearing. This shift in perception was both a blessing and a curse. It meant that geisha were treated with respect and admiration as cultural treasures, but it also reinforced the sense that they belonged to the past rather than the present, that they were museum pieces rather than vital parts of contemporary life. Today, estimates suggest there are somewhere between 600 and 1,000 geisha working in Japan, though exact numbers are difficult to determine since the profession remains somewhat secretive. Kyoto remains the heart of geisha culture, with several active hanamachi including Gion, Pontocho, Miyagawa-cho, Kamishi-chiken, and Gion Higashi. Together, these districts are home to probably fewer than 200 geiko and maiko. Tokyo has several smaller districts including Shinbashi, Akasaka, Asakusa, and a few others, with perhaps another 100 or so geisha total. Other cities like Kanazawa, Niigata, and a handful of hot spring resort towns have small numbers of geisha maintaining their traditions. But overall, the profession is a shadow of its former scale. This decline has led to concerns about the survival of the geisha tradition. Each generation seems to have fewer women willing to commit to the demanding training and restrictive lifestyle. The women who do choose to become geisha today are often motivated by a genuine love for traditional arts and a desire to preserve cultural heritage. They are not typically fleeing poverty or lacking other options, as might have been the case in earlier eras. They are making an informed choice to dedicate their lives to a difficult profession because they believe in its value. The training and lifestyle of modern geisha are somewhat less harsh than in previous generations, though still demanding. Compulsory education laws mean that girls cannot begin training as young as they once did. In most places, they must be at least 15 and have completed middle school before beginning their apprenticeship. Some regions require them to be 18 and have finished high school. Modern maiko have more personal freedom than their predecessors. In Tokyo districts, they are generally allowed to live independently rather than being required to stay in a nokiya, though Kyoto remains more traditional in this regard. They can own cell phones and maintain private lives separate from their professional identities. The strictest rules and limitations have been relaxed somewhat in recognition of changing times and the need to make the profession attractive enough to recruit new talent. The financial arrangements have also evolved. While the system of the okiya covering training costs and receiving the majority of apprentice earnings remains, there is generally more transparency and formal structure around these arrangements now. Women entering the profession have a clearer understanding of their obligations and timeline for becoming independent. The days of selling daughters into geisha houses are long over. Every woman who becomes a geisha today does so by her own choice, and can leave if she decides the life is not for her. The role that geisha play in Japanese society has also shifted. They are no longer primarily entertainers for wealthy businessmen, though that remains an important part of what they do. Increasingly, they are cultural ambassadors, performing at public events and festivals. giving interviews to journalists, even appearing on television programs to explain and demonstrate their arts. Some have social media presence carefully managed to maintain mystique while also making the geisha world more accessible to those curious about it. Tourism has become a significant factor in the modern geisha world. Visitors to Kyoto often hope to glimpse a maiko walking through Gion at dusk. Some are willing to pay significant sums for the opportunity to attend an ozushiki and experience geisha entertainment firsthand, often with translators present to help navigate the language and cultural barriers. While purists worry that this commercialization threatens the authenticity of geisha culture, others argue that tourist interest helps sustain the profession by providing an economic base that can support the expensive infrastructure required to maintain traditions. Public performances have also become more common and important. Each spring, the geisha communities of Kyoto put on elaborate dance performances called odori. The Miyako Odori in Gion is the most famous, featuring dozens of geiko and maiko performing in elaborate productions that showcase seasonal themes and traditional choreography. These performances, which originated in the Meiji era as a way to promote tourism and celebrate Japanese culture, have become beloved annual traditions that attract audiences from around the world. Similar performances happen in other cities and districts throughout the year. These public shows provide opportunities for ordinary people to experience geisha arts without the expense and exclusivity of private ozushiki. They also serve as important showcases for the training and skills that geisha have developed, concrete demonstrations that this is a serious artistic profession worthy of respect and preservation. The question of whether the geisha profession will survive into the future remains open. Optimists point to the continuing stream, however small, of young women who choose to enter the profession. They note that awareness and appreciation of geisha culture seems to be growing rather than declining, both within Japan and internationally. They argue that the very rarity of geisha makes them more precious and special, ensuring that there will always be demand for their unique form of entertainment. Pessimists worry that the economic model is unsustainable, that the expensive infrastructure of okiya houses, ochaya tea houses, and supporting craftspeople cannot be maintained with such small numbers. They note that many aspects of geisha culture depend on entire ecosystems of traditional arts and crafts. The wig makers who create katsura, the kimono weavers and dyers, the makers of kanzashi ornaments, the musicians who teach shamisen, the dance masters who preserve choreographic traditions. All of these depend on having enough active geisha to sustain demand for their services. As numbers decline, these supporting professions also disappear, making it harder for the remaining geisha to maintain their art. What seems certain is that the geisha of the future, if they exist, will be somewhat different from those of the past. They will need to balance tradition with adaptation, maintaining the essential elements that make geisha special, while also evolving to remain relevant in a changing world. This is a challenge that every traditional art form faces in modernity, and the geisha have been navigating it for decades now with varying degrees of success. For those of us looking in from outside this world, what should we take away from the story of the geisha? Perhaps most importantly, we should understand that geisha were and are real women pursuing a real profession, not the fantasies or stereotypes that popular culture has often made them out to be. They dedicated their lives to mastering difficult arts, to preserving cultural traditions, to providing a specific form of entertainment and hospitality that has value beyond its utilitarian purpose. The life of a geisha was never easy. Despite the beauty and elegance of its outward appearance, it required years of exhausting training, acceptance of strict rules and limitations, physical discomfort from elaborate dress and hairstyles, and the discipline to maintain perfect composure and grace regardless of personal feelings or circumstances. It meant sacrificing much of what we consider normal life: spontaneous freedom, private time, casual relationships, in service of a larger purpose. For some women, this sacrifice was worth it. They found satisfaction in mastering their arts, pride in carrying forward traditions, fulfillment in the camaraderie of the okiya and the broader geisha community, and pleasure in the admiration and respect their accomplishments earned them. They became part of something larger than themselves, links in a chain connecting past and future. For others, the sacrifice was too great, or the rewards insufficient, or the limitations too confining. Some left the profession after their apprenticeship, having gained valuable skills and experiences, but deciding that this life was not for them long term. Others stayed but chafed against restrictions, wishing for more freedom or different life circumstances. The geisha world was not paradise, and not every woman who entered it found happiness there. But what all geisha shared was a commitment to something beyond the merely personal. They understood themselves as part of a tradition, as carriers of cultural knowledge that would be lost if they did not maintain it. This sense of responsibility to something larger than individual preference or comfort is perhaps the most important lesson the geisha offer to those of us living in more individualistic times and places. The arts that geisha study are not valuable primarily for their economic potential, or even for their entertainment value, though they have both. They are valuable because they represent ways of being in the world, aesthetic philosophies that have been refined over centuries, connections to history and identity that cannot be replaced once lost. When a geisha learns traditional dance, she is learning not just steps but a language of movement that expresses Japanese values and sensibilities. When she masters the tea ceremony, she's entering into a ritual that has been performed for hundreds of years by thousands of people, becoming part of an unbroken lineage. This idea that culture is something that must be actively maintained and transmitted, that traditions are preserved not through museums and history books, but through living practice, is increasingly important in our rapidly changing world. The geisha have understood this intuitively even when they might not have articulated it explicitly. They have kept their arts alive not by freezing them in time, but by continuing to perform them, to teach them, to pass them along to the next generation of practitioners. As we watch the sun set on another day in one of Japan's ancient cities, as lanterns begin to glow in the narrow streets of the Hanamachi, as somewhere a maiko is carefully applying the white makeup that will transform her face, we might take a moment to appreciate what the geisha represent. They are not museum exhibits or quaint relics of a bygone era. They are living artists, professional women pursuing a demanding career, cultural preservationists maintaining traditions that might otherwise be lost. Their numbers may be small now, and the future of their profession uncertain. But for more than 2.5 centuries, geisha have adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining the core of what makes them special. They survived the transition from Edo to Meiji, from traditional to modern Japan. They endured the devastation of World War II and the confusion of the post-war period. They navigated the economic changes and social transformations of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Each generation of geisha has faced challenges specific to its era and has found ways to persist. The women who choose this path today do so with full awareness of its difficulties and limitations. They choose it anyway because they love the arts they study, because they value the traditions they maintain, because they find meaning in being part of something that transcends individual lives and connects past, present, and future. The story of the geisha is ultimately a story about the power of dedication, about the value of preserving beauty and tradition in a world that often seems focused only on novelty and efficiency. It is a reminder that some things are worth the years of effort required to master them, that discipline and sacrifice can lead to transcendent accomplishment, that there are forms of richness that have nothing to do with speed or convenience or modern measures of success. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you can carry with you an image of that Maiko walking through the evening streets of Kyoto, her kimono rustling softly, her wooden shoes clicking against the stone pathway. She represents something rare and precious, a living connection to centuries of cultural refinement and artistic tradition. She has chosen a difficult path, one that demands everything she has to give, and in doing so she keeps alive a flame that has been burning for more than 200 years. The world of the geisha endures, smaller than it once was but no less remarkable for that diminishment. It continues to fascinate and inspire, to challenge our assumptions about beauty and artistry and female agency. And it reminds us that there are many ways to live a meaningful life, that dedication to preserving cultural tradition is a worthy calling, and that true elegance comes not from superficial adornment, but from years of disciplined practice and deep understanding. As long as young women continue to choose this path, as long as there are those willing to dedicate themselves to mastering these difficult arts, the tradition will survive. It may change, it may adapt, but something essential will remain. And in that persistence there is hope not just for the geisha tradition specifically, but for all traditional arts and cultural practices that struggle to maintain relevance in the modern world. The geisha teach us that some things are worth preserving not because they are practical or profitable, but because they represent the best of what humans can achieve when they dedicate themselves fully to mastery and beauty. They show us that tradition and modernity need not be enemies, that it is possible to honor the past while living fully in the present, and they remind us that behind every tradition, no matter how exotic or foreign it may seem, are real people making real choices about how to live their lives and what values to prioritize. So let us leave them to their work, those few hundred women scattered across Japan who carry forward this ancient tradition. Let us appreciate them for what they truly are: artists, professionals, cultural guardians, rather than for the fantasies that popular imagination has projected onto them. And let us hope that their tradition continues to find new practitioners in each generation, keeping alive these beautiful arts that connect us to Japan's rich cultural heritage. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere tonight, in a traditional teahouse lit by soft lanterns, a geisha is performing for appreciative guests. She's playing her shamisen with skill developed over years of practice. She's dancing with grace learned through countless hours of training. She's engaging in conversation that seems effortless, but represents a lifetime of learning. She is doing what geisha have done for more than 2 centuries, maintaining a tradition that enriches all of us by its continued existence. The world of the geisha is mysterious and beautiful, demanding and rewarding, ancient and somehow eternal. It is a world that reminds us that some pursuits justify a lifetime of dedication, that tradition has value beyond nostalgia, and that true mastery of any art requires sacrifice and commitment that most of us will never be called upon to make. For that lesson, and for the beauty they bring into the world, we can be grateful to the geisha, those art persons who have chosen one of the most demanding paths imaginable, and who walk it with grace and dedication even today. The seasons turned in the Hanamachi just as they did everywhere else in Japan, but for the geisha, each season brought not just weather changes but an entire transformation of their world. The kimono they wore, the flowers in their hair, the songs they sang, the dances they performed, all shifted to reflect the passage of time through the Japanese year. This deep connection to seasonal change was not mere decoration, but represented a fundamental principle of Japanese aesthetics, one that the geisha embodied more completely perhaps than any other aspect of their culture. In January, as the new year began, the Hanamachi would come alive with special energy. This was a time of renewal and celebration, when geisha and maiko would make formal visits to the Ochaya tea houses where they worked, to their teachers and to important patrons, offering New Year greetings dressed in their finest formal black kimono decorated with family crests. The decorations in their hair would feature plum blossoms, which bloomed early and symbolized hope and perseverance through the cold winter months. The air would be crisp and clear, and the sound of shamisen music would drift from windows as geisha practiced the special dances reserved for New Year celebrations. The Ochaya themselves would be decorated with traditional New Year ornaments. Pine and bamboo arrangements at the entrance symbolized longevity and resilience. Special foods would be prepared, the elaborate dishes that marked this most important of Japanese holidays. Guests who visited during this season would be treated to entertainment that acknowledged the significance of the moment, the passing of one year into another, the hopes and aspirations that accompanied any new beginning. As January gave way to February, the decorations would shift. Plum blossoms would be replaced by early spring flowers, anticipating the warmth that was still weeks away. The geisha would begin preparing for the most important season in their calendar, the approach of spring and the cherry blossom festivals that would bring floods of visitors to their districts. This was a busy time, with extra rehearsals and preparation for the public performances that many Hanamachi would stage. March brought change that was almost palpable. The air would begin to warm, and the first genuine signs of spring would appear throughout Japan. For the geisha, this meant adjusting their kimono to lighter fabrics, changing the patterns to reflect budding branches and the promise of flowers soon to come. The songs and dances would shift too, incorporating themes of renewal and awakening. Everything was building toward April, the peak of cherry blossom season, and the most magical time in the geisha calendar. When the sakura finally bloomed, usually in early April, the transformation was complete. The narrow streets of districts like Gion would be lined with cherry trees in full flower, their petals creating a canopy of pale pink and white overhead. Tourists would flood into Kyoto by the thousands, all hoping to experience the ephemeral beauty of the cherry blossoms, and many hoping also to catch a glimpse of the equally ephemeral beauty of the maiko and geisha moving through these flower-laden streets. This was when many Hanamachi held their annual public dance performances. The Miyako Odori in Gyeonkobu, which had been held every April since 1873, was the most famous and prestigious of these performances. For an entire month, Geiko and Maiko would perform elaborate productions that showcased the highest levels of their training. The performances would take place in the Gyeonkobu Kaburenjo Theatre, a beautiful traditional building that seated hundreds of spectators on tatami mats or in Western-style chairs. The Miyako Odori was a spectacular affair that gave ordinary people a rare opportunity to see geisha arts performed at the highest level. The stage would be elaborately decorated with seasonal themes, cherry blossoms prominently featured in the sets and backdrops. The Geiko and Maiko would appear in their finest kimono, each more beautiful than the last, performing choreographed dances that told stories or celebrated the beauty of the season. An orchestra of shamisen players would provide accompaniment, their music filling the theatre with those distinctive sounds that had been associated with geisha for centuries. Before the main performance, audience members would be invited to participate in a brief tea ceremony, receiving a bowl of matcha green tea and a traditional sweet prepared by Maiko. This gave visitors a taste, however brief, of the hospitality and grace that defined geisha culture. Then the lights would dim, music would begin, and the dance would transport the audience into a world of refined beauty and traditional artistry. Other hanamachi held similar performances during the spring season. The Kamogawa Odori in Pontocho featured dances that made extensive use of fans, creating visual effects that were both stunning and deeply traditional. The Kyo Odori in Miyagawa-cho and the Kitano Odori in Kamishichiken each had their own distinctive styles and traditions. For anyone interested in geisha culture, attending one of these spring dance performances was an accessible way to experience something of their world without the expense and exclusivity of private ozushiki. As spring gave way to summer, the geisha world would adjust accordingly. The heavy kimono of winter and spring would be replaced with lighter garments made from summer fabrics, like linen or loosely woven silk. The colours would become cooler, blues and greens replacing the warmer tones of spring. Hair ornaments would feature summer flowers like hydrangea or morning glories. Even the patterns woven or painted onto kimono would shift, incorporating motifs like flowing water or fireflies that evoked the cooling sensation sought after during Japan's hot, humid summers. July brought one of Kyoto's most important festivals, the Gion Matsuri. This month-long celebration, centered around Yasaka Shrine and the Gion district, was one of Japan's oldest and most famous festivals. The Geiko and Maiko of Gion would play special roles during the festival, appearing in traditional attire to watch the elaborate parade of floats and to participate in various ceremonial events. For them, this was a time when their connection to their neighborhood and its history was most visible and most celebrated. The peak of summer was challenging for geisha and Maiko alike. The heat and humidity of Japanese summers were oppressive, and wearing multiple layers of kimono, even summer-weight ones, was uncomfortable. The makeup that was so beautiful in its finished state felt heavy and sticky in the heat. The wigs that geisha wore trapped heat against their heads, sometimes causing headaches or discomfort that had to be endured with perfect composure, yet the geisha maintained their standards regardless of the weather. A guest at an ozushiki in August would never see any sign of discomfort or fatigue, would never hear a complaint about the heat. The geisha would remain cool and graceful, creating an atmosphere of refinement that was all the more impressive given the challenging conditions. This ability to maintain perfect composure regardless of physical discomfort was one of the marks of true professionalism that distinguished accomplished geisha from lesser performers. As summer faded into autumn, perhaps the most beautiful season in the geisha calendar, the world would transform again. The scorching heat would give way to comfortable temperatures and crystal-clear skies. The maple trees that lined the streets and filled the gardens of Kyoto would begin their slow transformation from green to brilliant shades of red, orange, and gold. And the geisha would mark these changes in all the ways their tradition prescribed. Autumn kimono featured patterns of maple leaves, chrysanthemums, and other seasonal imagery. The colours would shift to warmer tones, russets and golds and deep purples that echoed the changing foliage. Hair ornaments would incorporate miniature maple leaves or chrysanthemum flowers, sometimes crafted with such skill that they looked almost real. The dances and songs would take on themes of harvest and preparation for winter, of appreciation for nature's beauty in its most glorious but fleeting moment. November was a particularly important month in the geisha world because it marked the beginning of several festivals and special occasions. The geiko of some districts would hold their autumn dance performances, less elaborate than the spring shows but no less beautiful in their own way. Wealthy clients would host special parties to celebrate the peak of autumn colours, hiring geisha to perform in gardens where the maple trees created breathtaking backdrops for the entertainments. As winter approached, the world of the hanamachi would begin to turn inward once more. The lighter kimono would be replaced with heavier ones, lined with silk batting for warmth. The colours would deepen, moving toward darker, richer tones suitable for the sombre beauty of winter. The geisha would prepare for the busy end-of-year season, when companies would hold elaborate year-end parties called bonenkai, forgetting the year parties, where employees and executives would gather to drink, eat, and be entertained while putting behind them the troubles and challenges of the year that was ending. December was exhausting for the geisha. Night after night would be filled with engagements, sometimes attending 3 or 4 different ozashiki in a single evening. They would move through the cold streets of the hanamachi, from one tea house to another, performing and conversing and pouring sake until the early hours of the morning. This was when they earned the majority of their annual income, this concentrated period of maximum demand. It was grueling work, but it was also satisfying to be so busy, to be so clearly valued and needed. This cyclical connection to the seasons represented something profound about the geisha tradition. It rooted them in the natural world and its rhythms, even as they worked in the artificial environment of tea houses and entertainment districts. It required them to remain constantly aware of time's passage, never allowing themselves to become static or repetitive. It meant that being a geisha required not just mastering certain skills, but developing an entire sensibility, a way of seeing and responding to the world that was informed by centuries of aesthetic tradition. The relationship between geisha and the natural world extended beyond seasonal changes to encompass a broader philosophy about beauty and impermanence. The concept of mono no aware, the pathos of things, the bittersweet awareness of beauty's fleeting nature, was central to Japanese aesthetics and found perfect expression in geisha culture. The cherry blossoms that bloomed brilliantly for just a few days before scattering were beautiful, precisely because they were temporary. The geisha, with her own fleeting youth and beauty, embodied this same principle. This awareness of impermanence informed everything about the geisha profession. A maiko's time in that role was limited by age and the completion of her training. Her most brilliant years, when she was most striking in her elaborate costume and makeup, would last only a handful of years before she transitioned to the more subdued appearance of a geisha. And even as a geisha, her career would eventually come to an end, whether through retirement, marriage, or simply the passage of time that made it increasingly difficult to maintain the demanding schedule and physical requirements of the profession. Rather than making the geisha sad or pessimistic, this awareness of impermanence seemed to heighten their appreciation for each moment. The evening's entertainment was precious precisely because it would never come again in quite the same form. The conversation with a particular guest was valuable because that exact exchange would never be repeated. The beauty of the season was to be savoured because it would soon give way to the next season's different beauty. This attitude, this philosophy of finding meaning and joy in the present moment while accepting its transience, was perhaps the geisha's most important teaching for those who took the time to understand their world. The arts that geisha studied and practiced were themselves expressions of this aesthetic philosophy. The tea ceremony, for instance, was built around the concept of ichigo ichie, one time, one meeting, the understanding that each tea ceremony is a unique occasion that will never occur again in exactly the same way. The seasonal flower arrangement, the specific tea bowl chosen for that day, the conversation that emerges organically among the participants, all combine to create a moment that is precious precisely because it is unrepeatable. When a geisha performed the tea ceremony, she was not simply following a set of prescribed movements. She was creating an experience for her guests, one that acknowledged the uniqueness of that particular moment. She would have chosen every element carefully, from the scroll hanging in the alcove to the sweets served before the tea, to the flower arrangement that provided a focal point for contemplation. Each choice was meaningful, reflecting the season, the occasion, and her own aesthetic sensibility. The dance that Geisha performed was similarly rooted in principles of meaningful restraint and suggestive rather than explicit expression. Unlike Western dance forms that often emphasize technical virtuosity, dramatic leaps, or rapid movement, traditional Japanese dance was characterized by controlled, deliberate gestures and subtle shifts in posture and expression. A dance that might last only 5 minutes could convey a complex narrative or emotional journey through tiny changes in hand position, the angle of the head, or the manipulation of a fan. Learning to dance at this level required more than just memorizing steps. It required developing an entire vocabulary of meaningful gesture, understanding the symbolic significance of different movements and positions. The opening of a fan might represent the rising sun or the unfolding of a flower. The angle at which a geisha held her body could convey modesty, invitation, sorrow, or joy. A turn of the head, executed at precisely the right moment with exactly the right speed, could be the emotional climax of an entire dance. The shamisen music that accompanied these dances was equally sophisticated and subtle. The instrument produced a sound that was deliberately harsh and unpolished, quite different from the smooth, refined tones that Western ears might expect from classical music. This roughness was intentional, valued for its emotional directness and its connection to human experience in all its complexity. The shamisen did not try to produce pure, perfect tones, but rather sounds that carried character and feeling, that expressed something true about human existence, even when that truth was difficult or uncomfortable. A skilled shamisen player could make the instrument sing, cry, laugh, or growl. The timing and emphasis of notes could completely change the emotional impact of a piece. The silence between notes was as important as the notes themselves, creating tension or release, anticipation or resolution. Playing the shamisen well required not just technical skill, but deep musical understanding and the ability to communicate emotion through sound. The songs that geisha sang, whether the long narrative pieces called nagauta or the shorter, more intimate kota, required similar levels of skill and interpretation. These were not simple folk songs but sophisticated art pieces with complex lyrics, drawn from classical poetry, historical narratives, or seasonal themes. The geisha had to understand not just the words and melody, but the cultural references, the historical context, the emotional undertones that gave the songs their deeper meaning. When a geisha sang, her voice would be somewhat nasal and high-pitched by Western standards, a vocal quality that was traditional and deliberate rather than a deficiency in training. This vocal style had developed over centuries and was considered the proper way to perform these classical pieces. Learning to produce this sound while also maintaining the subtle variations in tone and emphasis that made a performance emotionally engaging required years of dedicated study with master teachers. The flower arrangement that Geisha learned, ikebana, was another art form that seemed simple on the surface, but revealed profound complexity on deeper examination. Unlike Western flower arranging, which often emphasized fullness and abundance, ikebana was characterized by minimalism and careful attention to line, form, and space. An arrangement might contain only a few stems, positioned with mathematical precision to create a composition that was both natural and artfully constructed. The principles underlying ikebana reflected broader Japanese aesthetic values. Asymmetry was preferred over symmetry, as it was considered more natural and dynamic. Empty space was as important as the materials used, with the areas where nothing was placed contributing as much to the overall composition as the flowers and branches themselves. Seasonal appropriateness was crucial, with arrangements incorporating materials that reflected the current time of year and sometimes also referencing upcoming seasons or past moments. Creating an ikebana arrangement required the geisha to develop what might be called a way of seeing. She had to learn to perceive the inherent beauty and potential in natural materials, to understand how a particular branch wanted to curve or how a specific flower could anchor a composition. She had to develop an intuitive sense for balance and proportion, knowing when an arrangement was complete and when it still needed adjustment. These skills, once developed, influenced how she saw the world more generally, training her to notice and appreciate subtle beauty in everyday moments. Calligraphy, another of the traditional arts that Geisha studied, combined technical skill with artistic expression in ways that paralleled the other arts we have discussed. Writing with brush and ink on rice paper required precise control of hand movement, pressure, and timing. Each stroke had to flow naturally from the previous one, creating characters that were both legible and beautiful. The balance between structure and spontaneity, between following established forms and expressing individual style, was delicate and required years of practice to master. Great calligraphy was valued not just for its visual beauty, but for what it revealed about the character and spirit of the person who created it. The firmness or hesitation of a stroke, the balance and proportion of characters, the overall rhythm and energy of a piece, all were thought to reflect something essential about the calligrapher. For geisha, whose profession required them to cultivate refined taste and artistic sensibility, calligraphy served as both an art form to master and a form of personal cultivation. All of these arts, from tea ceremony to dance to shamisen to flower arrangement to calligraphy, shared common principles and reinforced one another. They all emphasized controlled restraint over dramatic excess. They all valued subtle suggestion over explicit statement. They all understood beauty as emerging from discipline and practice rather than from spontaneous inspiration, and they all required the practitioner to develop not just technical skills, but an entire sensibility, a way of being in the world that was informed by aesthetic principles refined over centuries. This comprehensive artistic training was what distinguished geisha from other entertainers, and what justified their continued existence as a distinct profession. Anyone could learn to pour sake or make conversation, but the geisha offered something more, a depth of cultural knowledge and artistic accomplishment that took years to develop, and that represented a living connection to Japan's aesthetic heritage. When a guest at an osashiki watched a geisha perform, they were witnessing not just an individual woman's skill, but the culmination of centuries of refinement and transmission of knowledge. The Okiya system, for all its limitations and challenges, served as the institutional structure that made this transmission of knowledge possible. within the walls of a geisha house, knowledge passed directly from one generation to the next through observation, imitation, and gradual improvement. The young Shikomi watched the senior geisha and learned not just what to do, but how to think about what they were doing. The Maiko accompanied her Wansan and absorbed lessons about timing, social dynamics, and artistic interpretation that could never be taught in a formal classroom. This apprenticeship model was ancient and had precedents in many traditional Japanese arts and crafts. The relationship between master and apprentice was central to how skills and knowledge were preserved and transmitted. Unlike Western educational models that emphasized explicit instruction and objective assessment, the traditional Japanese approach relied heavily on the apprentice's ability to observe carefully, imitate accurately, and gradually internalize the principles underlying the master's expertise. This meant that being a successful geisha required not just talent, but also the kind of personality that could thrive in such a learning environment. The woman needed to be patient, because progress would be slow and incremental. She needed to be observant, because much of what she needed to learn would never be explicitly explained, but would have to be inferred from watching others. She needed to be resilient, because criticism would be frequent and praise rare. And she needed to be genuinely committed to mastery, because anything less than total dedication would be insufficient to sustain her through the long years of training. The Wansanimuto relationship that formed the core of the training process was remarkably intimate and long-lasting. Unlike teacher-student relationships that might end when formal instruction was complete, the bond between an older sister and younger sister in the geisha world was expected to last a lifetime. The Wansan would guide Haramuto through every stage of training, introducing her to important clients, teaching her the unwritten rules that governed the profession, and providing emotional support through difficult times. In return, the Imuto was expected to show absolute loyalty and respect to her Wansan. She would assist her older sister whenever needed, whether with preparation for engagements or with personal matters. As the younger woman developed her own career and eventually became an independent geisha, she would continue to defer to her Wansan in matters of precedence and would maintain regular contact and consultation. This relationship created networks of connection and obligation that helped hold the geisha community together. The financial relationships within the geisha world were complex and sometimes controversial. Money flowed through multiple channels and was subject to various claims and obligations that could be difficult for outsiders to understand. When a guest hired geisha to entertain at an ozashiki, the fee would be paid not directly to the geisha, but to the Ochaya tea house where the entertainment took place. The Ochaya would then report the engagement to the Kenban registry office, which kept track of all geisha activities and handled the distribution of fees. From the total amount paid by the guest, various deductions would be made. The Ochaya would keep a percentage as its fee for providing the venue and arranging the engagement. The Kenban would take a smaller percentage for its administrative role. If the geisha lived in an okiya and had not yet repaid her training debt, the okiya would receive a substantial portion of the remaining amount. Only after all these deductions would the geisha herself receive her share. For an apprentice Maiko who still owed significant debt to her okiya, this might mean receiving only a small allowance for personal expenses while the bulk of her earnings went to her house. For an independent geisha who had repaid her debts and lived on her own, the situation would be much better, with the majority of the fees going directly to her after the Ochaya and Kenban deductions. But even independent geisha had to maintain relationships with Ochaya and pay regular fees for the privilege of working at particular establishments. This system had defenders who argued it was necessary and fair. The Ochaya provided essential services, maintaining beautiful traditional spaces where geisha could work and introducing them to wealthy clients who might become regular patrons. The Kenban registry system protected geisha from exploitation by ensuring transparent tracking of engagements and preventing clients from defaulting on payments. The Okiya investment model allowed talented young women from poor families to receive world-class training they could never otherwise afford. Critics, however, saw the system as exploitative, noting that it extracted the majority of value from the geisha's labor while leaving her with little financial security or independence. They pointed out that the debt bondage aspect, even if technically voluntary, created coercive conditions where women felt trapped in the profession, even when they might have preferred to leave. They argued that the closed, secretive nature of the geisha world made it difficult to know whether financial arrangements were truly fair or whether abuses were occurring behind the beautiful facade. The truth likely varied from case to case. Some okiya were run by former geisha who genuinely cared about their charges and ensured fair treatment and reasonable paths to independence. Other establishments were more mercenary, viewing their maiko primarily as income-generating assets to be worked as hard as possible for as long as possible. The experiences of individual women in the geisha world range from fulfilling and empowering to exploitative and damaging, depending on the specific circumstances and personalities involved. One aspect of geisha life that generated particular controversy was the historical practice of mizuage. This term literally means raising water, and in the context of traditional fishing, it referred to the day's catch. But in the geisha world, it came to have a much more troubling meaning. Historically, in some districts, mizuage referred to an auction of a maiko's virginity to the highest bidder among wealthy patrons. This practice, when it occurred, represented perhaps the darkest aspect of the geisha profession's history. A young woman who had dedicated years to training in traditional arts would, at the time she was transitioning from maiko to geisha, have her virginity sold to whichever man was willing to pay the most. The money from this transaction would go primarily to her okiya, ostensibly to help repay the enormous debt she had accumulated during her training. It is crucial to understand several things about mizuage. First, it was never universal across all geisha districts or all time periods. Some hanamachi never practiced it at all. In districts where it did occur, not all okiya participated, and not all maiko were subjected to it. Second, the practice was always controversial even within the geisha world, with many viewing it as degrading and inconsistent with the profession's emphasis on artistic accomplishment over sexual services. Third, the practice was outlawed with the criminalization of prostitution in Japan in 1956 and is not part of modern geisha culture. Nevertheless, the historical existence of mizuage has contributed to confusion about whether geisha were essentially prostitutes, a confusion that the profession has struggled to overcome. The reality is complex. Geisha were not prostitutes in the legal sense, as they were licensed as entertainers rather than as sex workers. Their professional role centered on artistic performance and social companionship. However, the mizuage practice, where it existed, did involve sexual exploitation of young women. An individual geisha did sometimes maintain sexual relationships with patrons, whether by choice or circumstance. Modern geisha strongly emphasize that their profession has never been primarily about providing sexual services, and they resent implications that they are equivalent to prostitutes. They point out correctly that the vast majority of what a geisha does involves studying and performing traditional arts, not providing physical intimacy. They note that the mizuage practice, when it existed, was an aberration that has been eliminated, and they argue that judging the entire profession by its worst historical aspects is unfair and reflects more about external prejudices than about the reality of their work. The Dana relationship mentioned earlier occupies an ambiguous space in this discussion. A Dana was a wealthy patron who provided ongoing financial support to a geisha in exchange for exclusivity and privileged access to her company. These relationships were formalized through ceremonies that resembled marriage, and they often lasted for years or even decades. Some Dana relationships were clearly transactional, with wealthy men essentially purchasing the exclusive services of particular geisha. Others developed into genuine affection and partnership, with the patron and geisha becoming close companions who valued each other's company beyond the merely commercial. Sexual intimacy might be part of a Dana relationship, but it was not necessarily the defining element. What the Dana primarily purchased was time and attention. He would have priority access to the geisha's schedule. When he wanted to host a party and have her attend, she would arrange her commitments to accommodate him. If he wanted to spend an evening enjoying her conversation and performances in an intimate setting, she would make herself available. The security and prestige that came with having a prominent Dana allowed the geisha to be more selective about other engagements and to focus on artistic development rather than constantly hustling for work. For a geisha, having a Dana was often seen as a mark of success and status. It meant she was accomplished and desirable enough to attract such a commitment from a wealthy patron. It provided financial stability that allowed her to invest in expensive kimono and training without worrying about where the money would come from. It freed her from some of the pressures of the marketplace, allowing her to focus on quality rather than quantity in her professional life. At the same time, the Dana relationship represented a loss of independence. The geisha was expected to prioritize her Dana's wishes and schedule above her own preferences. She was bound to him through obligation and custom in ways that limited her freedom of action. If the relationship became unhappy or uncomfortable, extricating herself could be difficult and might require formal intervention and negotiation. These complexities resist simple moral judgments. The geisha world operated according to its own logic and customs, shaped by centuries of tradition and by the particular economic and social conditions of Japanese society. Judging it by contemporary Western standards of gender relations and labor practices risks missing important nuances while also potentially imposing cultural values that may not be universally applicable. What we can say is that the geisha profession offered women in traditional Japan a path to a life that was unusual in its combination of artistic accomplishment, social prestige, and relative independence. While we should not romanticize the real limitations and challenges they faced, we should also recognize that being a geisha provided opportunities that were not available to most women in that time and place. They could support themselves financially. They could achieve fame and recognition for their talents. They could move through society with a freedom that wives and daughters typically did not enjoy. They could choose, within limits, how they lived their lives and what values they prioritized. The geisha were in some sense a third category of woman in traditional Japanese society, neither wife nor prostitute but something else entirely. They carved out a space for themselves where women could be accomplished, cultured, and valued for their talents rather than merely for their reproductive capacity or sexual availability. This achievement, however imperfect and complicated by the realities of their circumstances, deserves recognition as we try to understand what life was really like as a geisha. Sleep well tonight. knowing that the story of the geisha is richer and more complex than simple categories of oppression or empowerment can capture. Like all human experiences, it contains multitudes, contradictions that resist easy resolution. The women who chose or were chosen for this life made the best of their circumstances, often achieving remarkable things despite significant constraints. Their legacy endures in the arts they preserved, the traditions they maintained, and the continuing fascination their world holds for those who take time to look beyond stereotypes and truly understand what it meant to dedicate one's life to beauty and art.